Hey everyone, tonight we kick things off with the wild, unbelievable stories of folks who walked right beside knights, priests and peasants, and somehow turned "don't go out after dark" into an actual rule carved into medieval life. So before you settle in, take a quick second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you're really into what I'm doing here. No pressure, promise. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's seriously cool to see who's tuning in from all corners of the planet. Now dim those lights a little. Consider turning on a fan for a soft background buzz. Let's ease into tonight's story together, nice and slow. In the cozy little town of Chalons, sometime between the 15th and 16th century, there lived a man everyone respected, a tailor by trade, and allegedly a part-time cannibal. Because why not have hobbies, right? These days, we only know him as the Tailor of Chalons. This charming gentleman allegedly tricked children into his shop by offering cookies, fitting them for new clothes, or even dangling job opportunities in front of them. You know, the classic medieval version of too good to be true. Once they were inside, that's when things got grim. He'd kill them, chop them up, and here's where France really takes the cake. He turned them into meat pies. Human meat pies. Sweeney Todd? Please, the French might have beaten him to it by a few centuries. Rumor has it he ate these pies himself, and also served them to guests who had no clue what they were biting into. So if you ever wondered how people figured out something was wrong before Yelp reviews existed, well, this is precisely how things went off the rails. His creepy cooking habit stayed hidden until one brave kid managed to escape and raise the alarm. The townsfolk, either horrified or just sick of mystery meat, stormed his place. What they found wasn't some humble little tailor shop. Nope, this was more like a boutique of murder. Blood-stained tools, piles of bones, preserved flesh, enough evidence to make even the local priest puke on the spot. Naturally, he got arrested, and his trial? Legendary. When they asked him to defend himself, he didn't bother denying it. No blaming witches, no long speeches, just a very medieval shrug. His punishment? Burned alive at the stake, because back then that's how all the best nightmares ended. Some historians think the whole thing might have been blown out of proportion, maybe even propaganda meant to smear minorities or heretics. But whether it's fact, fiction, or a twisted cautionary tale, the Tailor of Chalons still stands as a warning. The line between respected tradesman and unchecked serial killer. In the Middle Ages, it was terrifyingly thin. Moral of the story? Always ask what's in the pie. And maybe don't trust any tailor who insists on doing fittings down in the basement. If medieval France had reality TV, Gilles de Rais would have been that wealthy noble who charmed everyone at dinner, but definitely kept a dungeon full of secrets. Literally. Before his rep went darker than a plague-ridden alley, Gilles de Rais was basically a national hero, a brave knight who rode beside none other than Joan of Arc. Yes, that Joan. He charged into battle under her banner, fought off the English, and made every grandma in the kingdom proud. For a while, he was medieval France's golden boy, minus the TikToks and a whole lot of armor. Then Joan was burned at the stake. And Gilles? Gilles went off script. After hanging up his sword, which really just meant he stopped legally stabbing people for the king, he dove headfirst into the theater, built stages, cast huge productions, spent fortunes on costumes, props, actors. Sounds fun. Until you realize he paid for it all by selling family heirlooms. Then he mortgaged everything he owned, possibly even his sanity. But the real horror show wasn't his spending. It was what was happening behind the curtain. Whispers started spreading. Servants vanished. Travelers disappeared near his estates. Alchemists showed up. People swore that black magic rituals were taking place. Eventually, the church, not exactly known for being chill, took notice. And what did they find in his castle? Even the toughest inquisitors were shaken. Hidden rooms, creepy tools, and let's say forensic science in the 1400s mostly involved people screaming, "Demon!" and throwing up. When they arrested Gilles, he confessed in horrifying detail. Whether it was guilt, madness, or just peer pressure, medieval style, he didn't hold back. Torture helped speed things along, as it usually did. But there was enough physical proof to erase all doubt. He wasn't just a killer. He'd turned it into a full-time gig. In 1440, Gilles de Rais was sentenced to death. They let him confess publicly and die with a bit of repentance, which, considering the stuff he was accused of, was more mercy than most thought he deserved. So how does someone go from holy war hero to one of France's most hated criminals? Easy. Take a hard left after the battlefield. Add unchecked wealth. Toss in an alchemist. Skip therapy entirely. If there was ever a medieval woman who'd absolutely crush Instagram's self-care scene, it was Elizabeth Bay, noble lady, landowner, and an alleged human exfoliator. Born in 1560 to one of Hungary's most powerful families, Elizabeth had it all: land, titles, castles, and supposedly a nighttime routine that'd give anyone nightmares. Forget face masks and lavender oil. Legend has it that she believed the secret to staying young forever was bathing in the blood of village girls. You know, like Gwyneth Paltrow, if Gwyneth took wellness advice way too literally. Of course, the truth, like most medieval history, is messy, full of missing records, political drama, and people with super suspicious motives. Elizabeth was crazy brilliant for a woman of her time, spoke 4 languages, ran estates, even defended her lands while her husband was away fighting as a war hero. After he died, she ran everything solo, which, in 17th century Hungary, meant every male relative suddenly decided she had too much power and needed to be taken down. Cue the rumors. Peasants started vanishing. Servants went to her castle and never came back. Witnesses claimed they saw corpses, strange bruises, bite marks, even signs of torture. One servant said Elizabeth had a custom iron cage hanging from the ceiling, like a piñata that screamed instead of dropping candy. Eventually, King Matthias of Hungary had had enough. He sent investigators, namely, a group of men who were not particularly fond of the idea of a woman owning multiple castles. Elizabeth got arrested in 1610, but not put on trial. Too messy. Instead, they tortured and executed her accomplices while she was quietly locked in a room in her own castle. Just a hole in the wall for food. Medieval house arrest, deluxe edition. Modern historians argue she might have been framed. The accusations conveniently allowed powerful men to seize her land. After all, who needs legal paperwork when you can yell witchcraft and call it justice? Still, guilty or not, the Bl0od Countess became a legend, a blend of true crime, folklore, and horrifying skincare myths that persist to this day. Moral of the story? If your beauty routine involves blood, you've gone too far, even for the Renaissance. Germany in the late 1500s wasn't exactly known for calm vibes or rational thinking. Plagues, religious wars, and the occasional demon-possessed goat made everyday life feel like a bad dream wrapped inside a worse one. Which is probably why the folks in Bedburg didn't bat an eye when someone blamed a string of brutal murders on an actual werewolf. Enter Peter Stump. Or Stumpf. Or Stubber. Or, let's be real, absolutely not someone you'd ever want near your livestock. He was a wealthy farmer living near Cologne. By daylight, totally normal. Owned land. Had kids, paid taxes. Probably waved politely at his neighbors like a good guy should. By night, that's where things got hairy. People started vanishing at scary rates. Bodies were found ripped apart, chopped up, or just plain gone. Livestock too. Something or someone was tearing through the countryside with the appetite of a medieval Uber Eats demon. Suspicion grew fast. Eventually, the townsfolk caught Stump after what they called a werewolf hunt, which is a phrase you usually only hear in bad fantasy novels or terrible courtroom dramas. Under torture, and when we say torture, we mean the kind that involves enthusiastic bone-breaking, popular with inquisitors back then, Stump confessed to a lot, not just murder. He claimed he'd made a deal with the devil, who gave him a magic belt that turned him into a wolf. Super eco-friendly, no full moon required. He also admitted to eating his victims, practicing dark magic, and, for extra medieval drama, having a romantic thing with his own daughter. Because apparently, you couldn't be accused of supernatural murder without throwing in some awkward family stuff too. Stump got executed in 1589, and the sentence was creative. First, they strapped him to a wheel and tore his flesh off with red-hot pincers. Then they smashed his limbs with the blunt end of an axe. Finally, they chopped off his head, burned his body, and also executed his daughter. In case this story ends gently, historians still argue today, was Peter Stump truly a monster, mentally ill, or just the unlucky scapegoat for a panicked, superstitious town? Either way, if someone ever offers you a magical werewolf belt, maybe stick to regular pants. Some families pass down jewelry, others pass down recipes. The Bean family, they allegedly passed down a generational love of eating people. Welcome to the legend of Alexander Saint Bean, a man who, according to 16th century Scottish folklore, decided that living in a seaside cave with his wife and eventually over 40 kids was the perfect combo of privacy, savings, and casual cannibalism. Now, historians still debate whether Sain even existed. His story doesn't show up in records until centuries later, and most of it feels like the kind of tale you make up after too many mugs of questionable ale. But hey, let's not let facts ruin a perfectly creepy bedtime story. According to legend, Sonny Bean and his wife moved into a cave on the Scottish coast near Ayrshire. The cave, deep, dark, cut off by high tide. Basically, the medieval version of a gated community, if your idea of luxury includes dripping seawater and echoing screams. There, they raised a huge, very tangled family. And by tangled, we mean the Bean family tree looked more like a circle. Incest? Apparently, it is more common than the body count. How did they eat? They didn't farm, didn't fish, didn't trade. Instead, they ambushed travelers on nearby roads, dragged them back to their lair, chopped them up, salted the leftovers for later, and tossed the bones into piles in sea caves. If this sounds like a grisly episode of MasterChef, you're not alone. Over the years, hundreds of people vanished along that stretch of road. Locals blamed witches, monsters, or English tax collectors. Nobody thought to check inside a damp coastal cave full of murderous meat lovers who ran their home like a haunted sausage factory. Eventually, even the king, usually too busy invading England or ignoring famines, got involved. A search party finally found the Bean Cave, along with proof of their horrific hobby. Body parts hanging like medieval charcuterie, barrels of salted limbs, generations of people who'd never seen sunlight or a vegetable. The whole clan got arrested and executed without trial. Most were burned alive, the others hacked apart. It turns out that even 16th century justice had its limits and patience. Real or not, the Sonny Bean story remains a reminder. If a creepy family invites you to dinner, always check the menu first. Now, not every medieval serial killer wore a crown or swung an axe. Some just showed up in the night sky with a pack of ghostly dogs, making noises like a haunted brass band. Enter Harlequin's hounds, a demonic hunting crew from medieval European folklore, best described as Scooby-Doo meets The Purge, minus the talking dog, plus way more screaming. Across Europe, especially in France, Germany, and England, people whispered about a ghostly parade that raced through the night sky or woods, led by a shadowy figure named Helquin, or Hurler, or Woden, depending on your zip code and local myth budget. These weren't your average campfire ghost stories. They were warnings. Don't go out after dark, or the wild hunt will snatch you and drag you into the afterlife, possibly while you're still alive. Very motivational. But here's where it gets suspiciously serial killery. In the 11th and 12th centuries, chroniclers started linking real deaths to sightings of this hunt. Bodies were found crushed, torn apart, or just gone, usually near forests or lonely roads. Some towns even passed laws banning travel after sunset, convinced the hunt wasn't just spooky. It was selective. It wasn't haunting. It was harvesting. Were there really ghost riders snatching souls into the void? Probably not. But were people using the myth to cover up real murders? Almost definitely. Think about it. You live in a superstitious village. Pitch black outside. Someone you didn't like just vanished after drunkenly bragging about seeing a glowing rider with black hounds. Oh no! The Helquin got him. Case closed. No investigation. No CSI Canterbury. Some historians believe the wild hunt myth may have been inspired by bands of mercenaries or cult-like vigilantes who used the tale as a form of psychological warfare. Kill someone. Blame the hunt. Ride off into the fog. Murder meets marketing. The kicker? The myth stuck around. Even centuries later, locals reported hearing hoofbeats and howling. always followed by missing people. And if there's one thing the Middle Ages were great at, it's turning folklore into crime scenes. So was Helquin a ghost, a metaphor, or the Middle Ages' most efficient scapegoat? Maybe all three. Either way, if you hear ghostly barking after midnight, lock your doors. Or better yet, don't wander into forests with names like Dead Man's Hollow. Germany, land of precision engineering, endless sausages, and apparently guys named Craftsman Ganapataninga, a name that sounds like someone sneezed on a medieval typewriter. Craftsman Ginapoding might not be as famous as Gilles de Rais or Elizabeth Bay, but if you measure by body count, he's the overachiever of medieval murderers. According to 16th century German pamphlets, basically the tabloids of their day, Janapina murdered 964 people over 15 years. And honestly, after victim number 400, you'd think he'd pick up knitting or something. The story goes like this. Craftsman set up shop in a forest cave, medieval serial killer starter pack. From this cozy murder den, he posed as a bandit, ambushing travelers, merchants, and anyone who looked even slightly stab-worthy. His methods: robbery, strangulation, general unpleasantness. Think Robin Hood if Robin kept all the loot and killed you afterward. He reportedly had help from a female companion he kidnapped and brainwashed, or, as medieval pamphlets put it, converted to his evil ways. Probably less Stockholm Syndrome, more help me or end up in the stew. But Craftsman didn't just kill. He kept souvenirs, gruesome ones, stored body parts, hoarded money, and, if we believe the pamphlets, baked the occasional victim into pies. That's right. Long before Sweeney Todd sang about meat-filled revenge, Craftsman was serving up his own version of forest-to-table cuisine. Eventually, someone caught on. Authorities nabbed him in 1581, and the execution? Let's say, elaborate. First, they broke him on the wheel, which is precisely as fun as it sounds. Then they tore his flesh with red-hot pincers. Then they did it again, and again, because someone really hated closing ceremonies. Finally, they decapitated him, just to be extra sure. Skeptics argue Craftsman might have been invented by Protestant propaganda, a fictional monster meant to represent godlessness, or maybe just bad cave hygiene. But others believe his crimes were terrifyingly real. Either way, Craftsman Janipa remains a horrifying footnote in Europe's blood-soaked history. A man with a kill count higher than most plagues, and a name longer than most grocery receipts. Welcome to Kilkenny Island, early 1300s, where Lady Alice Kittler had more dead ex-husbands than most people had decent meals. 4 of them, to be exact. And, like any good medieval soap opera, they all ended up mysteriously ill, broke, or dead. Born into a wealthy Flemish merchant family, Alice was the kind of woman who collected money and husbands with equal passion. By the time her 4th husband was found wasting away in 1324, basically medieval ghosting via grave, people started wondering if Alice had a hands-on approach to solving marital problems. Being a strong, independent woman in medieval Ireland was already a suspicious trait. But Alice also had property, money, influence, and a maid named Petronilla who couldn't keep a secret, especially under torture. That's when Bishop Richard de Ladra entered the chat. This bishop had the energy of a guy who read one book on witchcraft and immediately declared himself Grand Inquisitor. He accused Alice of heresy, sorcery, demon worship, love potions, and, most entertainingly, chatting with a demon named Robin Artisan, who supposedly visited her as a big black shaggy dog. That's right. Ireland's first alleged demon-possessed serial killer might have also been a crazy dog lady. But here's the twist. Alice escaped. Maybe she bribed guards. Perhaps she rode off into the mist on Robin Artisan's back. Either way, poof. Gone. Vanished. Meanwhile, poor Petronella, her maid, got left holding the cauldron. Literally. She was burned at the stake for witchcraft, becoming the first person in Ireland officially executed for heresy. To this day, Alice Kittler's guilt is hotly debated. Was she a clever killer hiding behind wealth and status? Or a victim of misogyny, paranoia, and one bishop's very weird fanfiction? Either way, she made history as Ireland's first woman accused of witchcraft, possibly its most infamous poisoner, and a sharp reminder: if your maid starts talking during an inquisition, it's already too late. Rome, city of popes, poets, and one teenage girl who turned revenge into something almost sympathetic. Beatrice Sani was born in 1577 to a noble Roman family that had immense wealth, considerable influence, and absolutely no sense of humor. Her father, Francesco Ceni, was by all accounts a full-blown monster. Rich, arrogant, and the kind of guy who thought discipline meant locking his family in castles, and allegedly doing way worse things polite scripts only hint at. Francesco's rap sheet? Violence, exploitation, a real talent for making everyone around him daydream about his funeral. Rome knew, the authorities knew, even the Pope knew. But because Francesco was loaded and well-connected, nothing ever stuck. Classic Renaissance legal strategy. If the bribes fit, you must acquit. So what's a traumatized daughter supposed to do? Well, murder. In 1598, Beatrice, her stepmother Lucrezia, and her brother Giacomo decided enough was enough. They allegedly drugged Francesco, smashed his head in with a hammer, and, just to be extra sure, tossed him off a balcony because nothing screams natural causes like blunt force trauma plus a fall. Of course, this wasn't CSI Vatican. The body was found. Questions got asked. Torture was applied. And soon enough, Beatrice and her family confessed. Some say torture loosened their tongues. Others say it just confirmed what everyone in Rome had been whispering for years, that Francesco Ceni totally had it coming. Now here's the part that turns tragic. Public opinion loved Beatrice. People didn't see her as a killer. They saw her as a martyr. A young woman who did what the courts never would. Petitions flooded in. Crowds begged the Pope for mercy. The Pope said no. On September 11th, 1599, Beatrice was beheaded in front of a massive crowd. The executioner reportedly held up her head, and the crowd wept, because for once the killer wasn't the villain. She was the symbol of a broken system that protected monsters and punished their victims. If you've ever watched Game of Thrones and thought, wow, that poison plot was clever, just know, Italian women of the Renaissance were light years ahead. These weren't just homemakers with grudges. They were pros, artists, chemists, entrepreneurs of death. They were the poisoners of Italy. Let's rewind to Renaissance Rome and Naples. Places bursting with corrupt clergy, lusty nobles, and arranged marriages where "till death do us part" was more of a suggestion. Here, in the shadows of palaces and convents, a quiet trade popped up, the making and discreet selling of aqua tofana, a colorless, tasteless, beautifully lethal liquid. Just a few drops in your husband's soup, voila, he's off to meet the saints. Leading this movement was a woman named Giulia Tofana, often credited or blamed with perfecting this little murder elixir. Sold under the guise of beauty products, of course. Aqua tofana came in vials labeled facial lotion or holy water of St. Nicholas. Subtle? Not even a little. But here's the kicker, this wasn't a one-woman show. Nope, Giulia had help, lots of it. Female apothecaries, widows, midwives, even nuns allegedly joined a shadowy network serving unhappy wives looking to edit their marriage contracts permanently. It wasn't so much a guild, more like a sorority for strategic life reorganization. Wondering why authorities didn't shut this down sooner? Hard to prove murder when the cause of death looks exactly like natural wasting. And with so many high-ranking clients, local courts prioritized survival over dispensing justice. Eventually, though, whispers turned to confessions. Giulia got arrested, and after some enthusiastic questioning, allegedly admitted to helping poison over 600 men. Others say the number was way lower, legend probably inflated it. Either way, the fallout was massive. Executions followed. Rome's streets got briefly cleaner. Aqua tofana got banned, publicly at least. So next time you hear about medieval guilds, don't just think blacksmiths or tailors. Think of a quiet backroom, a whispered name, and a tiny glass vial of destiny. You know the type, stern face, iron will, possibly allergic to smiling. Every medieval town had one. That one church official who insisted their harshness was just discipline. But sometimes, discipline looked suspiciously like serial murder. That's where Bishop Hatto of M steps in, or rather, slinks in, crozier in one hand, poison checklist in the other, probably. Let's start simple. Hatto was a 10th century bishop ruling over the region of Mainz in what's now Germany. A man of the cloth, yes, but that cloth might have been bloodstained. Allegedly, depending on who you ask, Hatto was either a hard-working administrator or the kind of clergyman who skipped straight to the fire and brimstone part of the Bible. He's best remembered for a tale that sounds suspiciously like medieval propaganda, but honestly, too horrifying not to include. During a brutal famine, peasants from Hatto's region came begging for food. Bishop Hatto, ever the humble servant of the Lord, welcomed them into a barn, then locked the doors, then set the barn on fire. Legend says he declared, "These are no men, they are rats." As the flames rose, normal bishop stuff, but karma in medieval legend comes with teeth. According to folklore, a swarm of actual rats chased Hatto to his tower on the Rhine and ate him alive. Hence, the tower's local name is the Mouse Tower. Historically accurate? Probably not. Morally satisfying? Absolutely. Skeptics argue that it's a metaphor, a fable about greed and justice, with rats serving as a divine punishment. Maybe Hatto didn't torch anyone. Maybe the barnfire story was cooked up by angry monks with killer storytelling skills. But here's the thing, nobody tells cautionary tales about nice bishops. This story stuck because deep down Hatto inspired fear. The kind that makes people whisper your name centuries later while shivering into their soup. Was he a serial killer? Depends. Do you count mass incineration during famine as murder, or just very aggressive spiritual cleansing? Either way, Bishop Hatto definitely wasn't just strict. The nunnery. Peaceful haven of quiet prayer, modesty, and brutal murder? Enter Sister Benedetta Carini, a 17th century Italian nun whose life reads like the first draft of a psychological thriller written by someone high on incense and unresolved trauma. Technically post-medieval, but her story's too juicy, too unhinged to leave out. Benedetta was an abbess in the Theatine convent of Pescia, Tuscany, famous for her visions, which included regular chats with Jesus, spontaneous stigmata, and some divinely inspired bed-shaking. At first, her fellow nuns were impressed. After all, medieval and early modern Italy loved a good mystic. But things quickly escalated from holy woman to what in the Mother of God is happening in this convent. As Benedetta rose in rank, so did the weirdness. She started having violent fits, claiming to be possessed by Jesus himself, who apparently treated her body like a weekend Airbnb. According to Benedetta, Jesus sought solitude and was deeply invested in confession. Exceptionally private, one-on-one confession. And this brings us to her roommate, Sister Bartolomea. Bartolomea later confessed that Benedetta used these possessions as cover for, let's say, deeply non-canonical activities. According to testimony, Benedetta would claim to be channeling divine forces, then insist Bartolomea submit to spiritual correction, multiple times with passion and very little scripture involved. But what makes Benedetta truly unsettling, beyond the forbidden trysts and religious cosplay, was her alleged manipulation and cruelty. Witnesses claimed she psychologically dominated other nuns, handed out harsh punishments, and even used her visions to silence anyone who disagreed. Several deaths happened under mysterious circumstances in her convent. She was never formally charged with murder, but let's just say it wasn't precisely a spiritually uplifting place. Eventually, the church caught wind of the scandal. A formal investigation was launched. Benedetta got stripped of power and imprisoned inside the convent for the rest of her life. The church, in classic damage control mode, buried her story, which was then rediscovered centuries later to the horror and fascination of modern historians. So was Benedetta Carlini a victim of religious hysteria? A misunderstood mystic? Or just a really clever predator in a wimple? Either way, confession has never sounded quite so ominous. Some people paint, some collect coins, and some, if you're Cardinal Robert of Geneva, treat mass murder like it's a team sport. Let's set the bloody stage. It's 1377. Cesena, a picturesque little town in northern Italy, made the mistake of mildly questioning papal authority. That's like telling a medieval pope his hat looks a bit much. Heresy, sedition, Cue the overreaction. Enter Cardinal Robert of Geneva, who'd later become Pope Clement VII. Not to be confused with the Clement who made wine. This one made body piles. The Papal States were in chaos, Italian city-states doing what they do best. Switching sides like it's a medieval reality show. Cecina had revolted or maybe just sneezed the wrong way, and the church decided to make an example. And by example, we mean war crime. Cardinal Robert, accompanied by John Hawkwood, a charming English mercenary who never met a paycheck he didn't like, marched into Cecina with French and Breton troops. The town had already surrendered peacefully, thinking things were settled. Classic mistake. Once inside, the army began a 3-day massacre. Not just rebels, civilians, priests, older men, anyone who couldn't outrun a guy with a sword and poor impulse control. Between 2,000 and 5,000 people were slaughtered. That's not cleansing. That's a medieval purge with paperwork. Robert later defended himself by claiming the massacre was necessary to restore order. Same way using a flamethrower on a fly is technically pest control. Was he a serial killer? Technically, no. He didn't stalk individual victims. Wasn't doing it for pleasure. But here's the twist, he did it more than once. Cecina wasn't a one-time oops too much smiting moment. Robert had a pattern, solving problems with fire, blades, and mass panic. And he got promoted for it. Became an antipope like a regular pope, but with more political drama and significantly worse Yelp reviews. Robert of Geneva earned the nickname Butcher of Cecina, not from his enemies, but from the people chronicling the event. When your historical nickname sounds like it belongs on a deli sign, but involves thousands of corpses, you've probably crossed a line. Moral of the story, never trust a cardinal with a sword and something to prove. Grave robbing in medieval Europe? Believe it or not, booming cottage industry. While modern folks complain about student loans or housing prices, medieval peasants had slightly different side hustles, such as looting fresh graves, selling teeth, and occasionally misapplying the definition of deceased. Welcome to the cheerful tale of the resurrection men. Not to be confused with literal resurrection, they weren't qualified for that, though they often gave it a shot anyway. These weren't your standard post-burial grave robbers. Nope, this gang specialized in pre-burial withdrawals. Let's focus on one case from 14th century Bohemia, where a particular band of gravediggers/opportunists developed a habit of helping people pass on before they actually had. In other words, if someone looked a bit pale, a bit limp, or heaven forbid, merely unconscious, the resurrection men might decide to help nature along with a shovel. Or a rock. Or, in one recorded case, just by burying them alive. Anyway, these were rough times. Death was basically a roommate. Plague, famine, inquisitions, wolves with too much free time. And in all that chaos, the line between almost dead and actually dead got blurry. For grave robbers paid by the corpse, that line was especially negotiable. The profession attracted folks with, shall we say, flexible ethics. One Bohemian ring was accused of suffocating plague victims before they were entirely gone. Why? Because corpses are easier to transport than people who are still breathing and screaming about being kidnapped. They'd then sell the bodies to medical students, alchemists, or overly curious monks, or worse, use them to fake martyr relics and get rich selling holy femurs of St. Kevin. Never mind that St. Kevin never made it past Slovakia. The church was horrified, obviously, but also secretly intrigued, because corpse-based miracles? Kinda their thing. Authorities eventually caught on when one dead man woke up mid-sale, which tends to kill resale value, and cause shouting. So were they serial killers? Not in the traditional alleyway hunting sense. But their tally of early departures suggests a professional interest in expedited exploration. And in medieval times, that's really all it took to join the club. In modern times, we've got criminal profilers, DNA testing, CCTV, and that one neighbor who knows way too much about everyone's business. But in medieval times, if someone got murdered in the woods and no one saw it, well, that was basically just Tuesday. Let's talk about the ones we never caught. The silent monsters who roamed without names, motives, or even half-decent sketches. They left no journals, no manifestos, just a trail of conveniently missing villages, and the occasional cryptic stain in a barn. Case in point, the werewolf of Poligny. In 1521, France, yes, were fudging the medieval cutoff by about 20 years, but trust me, nobody had updated their ethics software yet. Villages were found ripped apart and not stabbed and not beaten. Torn. Naturally, this led to the only logical explanation: werewolves. 3 men were eventually arrested and confessed to the crime. But if you've ever tried saying, "I'm not a werewolf," while being mildly waterboarded with wine and guilt, you'll understand why confessions in medieval Europe aren't exactly reliable. Then there's the Crossroads Killer in Eastern Europe, a series of unsolved disappearances near merchant routes between Poland and Ruthenia. Bodies, when found, were often mutilated and dumped near crossroads, traditional dumping grounds for anything unholy, including old boots, pagan idols, and apparently serial killer leftovers. The crimes were blamed on highwaymen, witches, demonic woodcutters, you name it. The real killer? We'll never know. Let's not forget the monastery murders of Devon, circa 1304. For monks vanished over a single winter. Locals blamed wolves. Wolves, for their part, issued a formal denial. A 5th monk survived, found naked, muttering about the one in the red hood. No culprit, no trial, just lots of awkward silence, and hastily rewritten abbey records. These phantom killers had several advantages. 1, they lived in an era where death was a constant presence. 2 witnesses could be bribed with a chicken and a hint of fear of hell. 3, no fingerprints, no forensics, definitely no podcasts about their crimes. So, when we talk about the most notorious medieval serial killers, spare a thought for the ones who never made it into the annals, not because they weren't brutal, but because they were just that good at staying in the shadows. Eleanor of Aquitaine was born in 1122 into a world that would soon feel her presence like a storm breaking over calm seas. She was the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, and Henri de Châtellerault, and from her earliest years, she soaked up the culture and grandeur of one of Europe's richest duchies. Aquitaine wasn't some backwater county. It was a land of abundance, where vineyards spilled over rolling hills, troubadours sang of love and valor, and courts buzzed with poetry and music. Unlike the rigid, often dour northern kingdoms, southern France lived with passion, style, and an almost Mediterranean flair. It was into this vibrant world that Eleanor was raised, and it shaped her worldview for the rest of her long, remarkable life. Tragedy struck early. In 1137, her father died suddenly while on pilgrimage, leaving 15-year-old Eleanor not just an orphan, but also the undisputed Duchess of Aquitaine. With that inheritance, she instantly became the most sought-after prize in Europe. Her land stretched from the Loire River down to the Pyrenees, a domain larger and wealthier than even the holdings of the French crown itself. Every ambitious nobleman dreamed of securing her hand, and with it, control over Aquitaine's people, trade, and castles. But Eleanor wasn't some passive trophy to be claimed. Even as a teenager, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew she was born to rule. Chroniclers describe her as intelligent, charismatic, and strikingly beautiful. But her true power? It wasn't in her looks. It was in her sharp mind and political instinct. She'd been educated in literature, music, and governance, making her far more prepared to wield power than many men twice her age. It didn't take long for King Louis VI of France to realize such a duchess couldn't be left vulnerable to rival suitors. He swiftly arranged for Eleanor to marry his son and heir, the young Louis VII. Within months of her father's death, Eleanor was escorted north, surrounded by armed guards to ensure her safety. The girl from the cultured courts of Aquitaine was about to enter a harsher, colder world, the throne of France. Eleanor of Aquitaine had begun her journey, not as a quiet bride, but as a ruler in her own right. And she was only just getting started. At just 15, Eleanor was thrust into a new role, Queen of France. Her marriage to Louis VII in 1137 wasn't the union of equals she might have imagined. It was a collision of 2 very different worlds. Louis, raised in a cloistered, pious environment, had once been destined for the church before his older brother's unexpected death made him heir to the throne. He brought into marriage an air of austerity, preferring prayer and ritual over laughter and feasting. Eleanor, by contrast, embodied the spirit of Aquitaine, vibrant, confident, steeped in a culture that prized art, music, and poetry. Their union was less a meeting of hearts than a merger of political necessity. Paris, where Eleanor was now expected to rule beside her husband, felt bleak and cold compared to the warm, cultured south she'd left behind. The French court was dominated by rigid traditions and suspicious courtiers, many of whom viewed Eleanor's independence as dangerous. They whispered about her boldness, her fashionable clothes, her insistence on bringing troubadours and poets into the royal household. To the conservative elite, she was too outspoken, too flamboyant, too much. Yet Eleanor refused to shrink herself. She infused Paris with Aquitaine's love of refinement, commissioning music and literature, setting the stage for what would later evolve into the ideals of courtly love. Still, her marriage to Louis quickly revealed its cracks. He was cautious, often indecisive, more interested in spiritual matters than political maneuvering. Eleanor, on the other hand, had been raised to govern and expected to be heard. Her sharp tongue and unflinching honesty frequently clashed with Louis's timidity. She mocked his hesitations. He bristled at her ambition. Their differences, far from complementing each other, grew into sources of tension. Yet even in these early years, Eleanor showed the qualities that would make her one of Europe's most remarkable rulers. She advised her husband on matters of state, became involved in diplomacy, and began to cultivate her own network of influence. Though Louis was king, it was Eleanor's wealth and authority over Aquitaine that gave the crown much of its real power. Without her, the French monarchy would have been far weaker. By the time the call for the Second Crusade sounded, Eleanor wasn't just Queen of France. She was a woman determined to prove she was more than a decorative consort. She was ready to take her ambitions onto the world stage. In 1147, the call went out across Christendom. The Second Crusade had begun. The fall of Edessa to Muslim forces shocked Europe, and Pope Eugenius III rallied the faithful to reclaim the Holy Land. Louis VII, eager to prove himself a devout Christian king, quickly took up the cross. But what stunned everyone? Eleanor's decision. She too vowed to go east, not as a passive queen but as a leader in her own right. Her choice was bold, even scandalous. Few women of her rank joined crusades, and even fewer did so with the determination to lead their own vassals. Eleanor summoned knights from Aquitaine, many loyal more to her than to her husband, and announced she would accompany them to the Holy Land. Chroniclers recorded the shock of the French nobility. Here was a queen, not content to wait in Paris, demanding a sword-bearing role in the most sacred war of the age. As the armies marched, Eleanor became a figure of fascination. She traveled at the head of her retinue, dressed in armor, and commanded attention wherever she went. Troubadours would later romanticize her presence, claiming she embodied the very ideals of chivalry and courtly love. Yet her involvement also sowed discord. Louis, already insecure about his authority, found himself overshadowed by his wife's charisma and decisiveness. Soldiers whispered they'd rather follow Eleanor than their hesitant king. The crusade itself? A disaster. Poor planning, squabbling leaders, treacherous terrain. The French army's march through Anatolia turned into a nightmare of starvation and ambush. By the time they reached Antioch, morale was shattered. It was here that Eleanor's influence peaked, and her marriage began to unravel. Raymond of Poitiers, her uncle and Prince of Antioch, welcomed her with open arms. Eleanor admired his energy and strategic vision, and urged Louis to support him in a campaign against Aleppo. Louis refused, insisting on continuing to Jerusalem. Rumors exploded. Chroniclers suggested Eleanor and Raymond were too close, perhaps even lovers. Whether gossip or truth, the scandal spread like wildfire. Louis, humiliated, ordered Eleanor to leave Antioch with him by force. The crusade limped on, achieving nothing of note. But the damage was done. When the royal couple returned to France, their marriage was beyond repair. The crusade had revealed two truths to the world. Louis was an ineffectual king, and Eleanor of Aquitaine was a woman who would not be silenced. By the early 1150s, Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII was in tatters. The crusade had left scars too deep to ignore. Whispers of infidelity, political disagreements, and above all, the absence of a male heir. Though the couple had 2 daughters, Louis longed for a son to secure the Capetian dynasty. Eleanor, for her part, seemed increasingly frustrated by his timidity, and his refusal to let her exert the influence she believed was her right. Their union, once forged as a political alliance, now stood as a constant reminder of incompatibility. In 1152, the inevitable came at bugency. The marriage was formally annulled on the grounds of consanguinity. They were distant cousins, and the church, eager to end the scandal, accepted the excuse. Eleanor was free. Her daughters remained with Louis, and she once again controlled Aquitaine in her own name. Few women in medieval Europe had ever regained such a high level of independence. But Eleanor wasn't a woman to live long without a crown. Almost immediately, suitors began circling. Her lands made her the most eligible heiress in Europe for the second time. Some tried to abduct her on her journey home, hoping to force marriage by kidnapping. But Eleanor was shrewd and swift. Within weeks of her annulment, she struck a daring alliance. She married Henry of Anjou, the fiery, ambitious duke, nearly 12 years her junior. Their wedding was sudden, bypassing the need for French royal approval, and it shocked the courts of Europe. This was no ordinary match. Henry wasn't just Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. He was also in line to inherit the English throne. Their union fused Aquitaine, Normandy, and Anjou into a vast power block that rivaled, and even threatened, the French crown itself. When Henry became King of England in 1154, Eleanor was once again a queen, but this time not of a single kingdom. She was queen consort of an empire stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. Her second marriage wasn't built on romance, but on raw power and ambition. Eleanor had moved from being the frustrated consort of a timid king to the partner of one of Europe's most dynamic rulers. But as she would soon learn, life with Henry would bring both triumph and turmoil. When Henry Plantagenet ascended the English throne in 1154 as Henry II, Eleanor once again found herself wearing a crown, this time in Westminster, not Paris. At 32, she was already a seasoned ruler, but now her influence stretched across an empire historians would later call the Angevin Empire, from the misty highlands of Scotland to the sun-soaked vineyards of Aquitaine. As queen consort, Eleanor wasn't content with ceremonial duties. She ruled actively, especially in her beloved Aquitaine, where her authority was unquestioned. But Eleanor's most incredible legacy during these years? Her role as mother. Between 1153 and 1167, she bore Henry 10 children. 5 sons and 3 daughters survived to adulthood, ensuring the continuation of the dynasty. Her sons weren't ordinary princes. They'd become some of the most famous names in medieval Europe. Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey of Brittany, and John the future Lackland. Each inherited not only their father's ambition, but also their mother's fiery spirit. And Eleanor took a deep interest in their upbringing. She encouraged them to see themselves not just as rulers, but as heirs to a culture of refinement. In her courts, she invited troubadours, poets, and scholars, exposing her children to the ideals of chivalry and courtly love, while Henry focused on law, administration, and expanding his dominion. Eleanor created a cultural identity for the dynasty that distinguished it from the somber traditions of northern monarchies. But her marriage to Henry was far from blissful. Though united by ambition, the two were equally strong-willed, and sparks often flew. Henry was notoriously unfaithful, fathering children with mistresses, and Eleanor's pride bristled at the humiliation. The couple spent increasing time apart, Eleanor often ruling Aquitaine independently, while Henry managed affairs in England and Normandy. Still, their political partnership remained formidable, their combined lands dwarfing the holdings of the French crown. As her sons grew, Eleanor poured her energy into preparing them for their future roles. But in doing so, she also planted the seeds of rebellion. Her loyalty was never unquestioning. She believed her children should have power of their own, not remain under Henry's iron grip. And when her sons turned against their father, Eleanor would make a decision that shocked Christendom. She would side with them, even against her king. The queen who had once marched on crusade was about to march into family rebellion. By the 1170s, Eleanor's marriage to Henry II had soured beyond repair. Once bound by shared ambition, the couple had grown into bitter rivals. Henry's relentless expansion of royal authority and his endless string of mistresses had humiliated Eleanor. Worse still, he refused to grant their grown sons real power, keeping them dependent while he ruled like an emperor. For Eleanor, this wasn't just a personal insult. It was a dangerous political miscalculation. Their sons, restless and ambitious, were ready to rebel, and Eleanor was prepared to help them. In 1173, the storm broke. Henry the young king, frustrated at being crowned co-king without any proper authority, allied with his brothers Richard and Geoffrey to rise against their father. Eleanor, ruling Aquitaine with increasing independence, encouraged their cause. Chroniclers suggest she secretly coordinated with her sons, and even sought support from Henry's greatest enemy, King Louis VII of France, her former husband. It was a bold move, one that risked everything. But Henry was no easy foe. He crushed the rebellion with ruthless efficiency, defeating his son's forces in Normandy and England. Eleanor's involvement didn't remain hidden for long. In 1174, while traveling to join her rebellious children, she was captured by Henry's men. Betrayed and powerless, she was brought before the king, who could not tolerate such defiance from his own queen. Henry's punishment was harsh. Eleanor was imprisoned, first in England, then moved between various castles. For the next 16 years, she lived under house arrest. Her once vast influence was reduced to whispers through the walls of her confinement. She was allowed little contact with the outside world, cut off even from her beloved Aquitaine. Yet even in captivity, Eleanor's legend grew. Troubadours continued to sing of her beauty and wit, and stories of her defiance spread through Europe. Her sons, though defeated, still saw her as the guiding force of their ambitions. She became a symbol of resistance against Henry's suffocating rule, a queen who refused to bow quietly. Eleanor endured her imprisonment with patience and calculation, waiting for the moment when fortune's tides would turn. That moment came in 1189, when Henry's death finally released her chains and restored her to the center of power. The imprisoned queen was about to rise again, this time as the matriarch of kings. In July 1189, Henry II died at Chinon, broken and embittered, betrayed by the very sons he'd tried to control. When news reached Eleanor, still under guard, the tide of her fortune shifted in an instant. After 16 years of confinement, she was released, not as a widow cast aside, but as the indispensable mother of the new king, Richard the Lionheart. At 67, Eleanor stepped back onto the political stage with the authority of experience and the aura of survival. Richard adored his mother. Unlike Henry, who had sought to stifle her influence, Richard recognized her value. He entrusted her with responsibilities that went far beyond ceremony. While he prepared for the Third Crusade, Eleanor became Regent of England, overseeing the realm's administration, finances, and diplomacy. For a woman in her late 60s, this was nothing short of extraordinary. Yet Eleanor embraced the task with vigor. Her rule was pragmatic and practical. She traveled tirelessly across the kingdom, ensuring loyalty to Richard and quelling dissent. She organized the immense taxation needed to fund his crusade, smoothing over resentment with her charisma and authority. In an age where many barons might have seized the chance to weaken royal power, Eleanor's steady hand preserved the realm. She was no longer merely a duchess, queen, or consort. She was a matriarch, governing in the name of her son. When Richard departed for the Holy Land in 1190, Eleanor's role became even more critical. She not only safeguarded his kingdom but also navigated the delicate politics of succession. With Richard gone, whispers swirled about his younger brother, John, ambitious, impatient, eager to claim power. Eleanor worked tirelessly to suppress these ambitions, warning nobles against betrayal, securing Richard's position from afar. Even more impressively, she continued to wield influence on the international stage. She corresponded with rulers, arranged alliances, negotiated marriages for her children and grandchildren. She was the glue that bound the sprawling Angevin dynasty together, her voice carrying weight across courts in France, England, and beyond. For Eleanor, this was vindication. Once silenced and imprisoned, She now stood at the center of European politics once more. But her most significant test as Queen Mother was still to come: Richard's capture on his return from crusade, and the ransom that would nearly bankrupt kingdoms. And it would be Eleanor herself who rode at the heart of that crisis. The year 1192 brought disaster. As Richard the Lionheart returned from the Third Crusade, he was captured near Vienna by Leopold of Austria, a former ally turned bitter enemy. Soon after, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI claimed custody, demanding a ransom so colossal it stunned Christendom: 150,000 marks, roughly 2 to 3 times England's annual income. For most kingdoms, it would have been impossible. But Richard had one advantage no other monarch could boast: his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. At 70 years old, Eleanor should have been enjoying quiet widowhood. Instead, she became the driving force behind the effort to free her son. She toured England tirelessly, raising the ransom through special taxes, confiscations of church treasures, and loans from merchants. Chroniclers describe her traveling from town to town, appealing to both clergy and nobles alike. Her presence, commanding and persuasive, galvanized the kingdom. People gave, not just out of duty, but because Eleanor's authority left no room for hesitation. Yet even as she fought to save Richard, Eleanor faced another battle: her youngest son, John. True to form, John attempted to exploit his brother's imprisonment, scheming for the crown. He allied with Philip Augustus of France, Richard's longtime rival, and plotted to seize control of England. But Eleanor, ever the political strategist, countered him at every turn. She warned nobles against supporting John, fortified key castles, and made sure Richard's throne remained intact until his return. In 1194, after 2 years of relentless effort, Eleanor traveled personally to Germany to deliver the final ransom payment. Imagine the scene: an elderly queen, still regal, unbowed, presenting the gold and silver that represented the sacrifices of an entire kingdom. When Richard was finally freed, it was Eleanor who accompanied him back, her presence a symbol that even kings owed their crowns to her resolve. Richard's release was Eleanor's greatest triumph, but also her last great act for him. Within 5 years, he would die from a wound in battle, leaving the crown to John, the very son she'd spent so much time restraining. Now, in her twilight years, Eleanor would face her final challenge: guiding a flawed king and ensuring the survival of the dynasty she'd sacrificed so much to build. By the late 1190s, Eleanor of Aquitaine was well into her 70s, an age few medieval women ever saw, let alone while still wielding power. The death of Richard the Lionheart in 1199 was a devastating blow. He had been her favored son, the one who trusted her wisdom and respected her authority. His death left the crown in the hands of her youngest child, John, a man whose flaws were as legendary as his lineage. Eleanor, though weary, stepped once more into the fray to secure the throne for him. John's succession was contested. Arthur of Brittany, the son of Eleanor's deceased son Geoffrey, had a strong claim and the support of many in France. Eleanor, however, was determined to see John crowned. She traveled to Aquitaine, rallying her vassals and fortifying her duchy in his name. In her late 70s, she endured sieges, negotiated with nobles, and displayed the same resilience she'd shown as a young duchess. Chroniclers marveled at her stamina. This was no queen mother content to fade quietly into the background. In 1200, Eleanor played a final role on the international stage, journeying to Castile to escort her granddaughter Blanche north, arranging her marriage to the future Louis VIII of France. Even at nearly 80, she rode across the Pyrenees, managing delicate diplomacy with the skill of a veteran stateswoman. Her efforts not only strengthened dynastic ties, but also solidified her role as a pivotal figure in European politics. As her health declined, Eleanor withdrew to the Abbey of Fontevraud, a place of peace after a lifetime of turbulence. Yet even here, she was no passive figure. She remained a revered matriarch, her counsel sought by kings and nobles alike. She outlived most of her contemporaries, a living legend whose life spanned from the world of the early Crusades to the dawn of the 13th century. Eleanor died in 1204 at the age of 82, a remarkable span in an age when life was often short and brutal. She was laid to rest at Fontevraud, beside Henry II and Richard the Lionheart, husband and son, rivals and allies. Her tomb effigy shows her not with folded hands in prayer, but holding an open book, as if still reading, still learning, still ruling. Her legacy was immense. A duchess, two-time queen, mother of kings, patron of culture, and one of the most formidable women in medieval history. Eleanor of Aquitaine had lived not just one life, but many, and in each she had left an indelible mark on Europe. By the late 1190s, Eleanor of Aquitaine was well into her 70s, an age few medieval women ever saw, let alone while still wielding power. The death of Richard the Lionheart in 1199 was a devastating blow. He had been her favored son, the one who trusted her wisdom and respected her authority. His death left the crown in the hands of her youngest child, John, a man whose flaws were as legendary as his lineage. Eleanor, though weary, stepped once more into the fray to secure the throne for him. John's succession was contested. Arthur of Brittany, the son of Eleanor's deceased son Geoffrey, had a strong claim and the support of many in France. Eleanor, however, was determined to see John crowned. She traveled to Aquitaine, rallying her vassals and fortifying her duchy in his name. In her late 70s, she endured sieges, negotiated with nobles, and displayed the same resilience she'd shown as a young duchess. Chroniclers marveled at her stamina. This was no queen mother content to fade quietly into the background. In 1200, Eleanor played a final role on the international stage, journeying to Castile to escort her granddaughter Blanche north, arranging her marriage to the future Louis VIII of France. Even at nearly 80, she rode across the Pyrenees, managing delicate diplomacy with the skill of a veteran stateswoman. Her efforts not only strengthened dynastic ties, but also solidified her role as a pivotal figure in European politics. As her health declined, Eleanor withdrew to the Abbey of Fontevraud, a place of peace after a lifetime of turbulence. Yet even here, she was no passive figure. She remained a revered matriarch, her counsel sought by kings and nobles alike. She outlived most of her contemporaries, a living legend whose life spanned from the world of the early Crusades to the dawn of the 13th century. Eleanor died in 1204 at the age of 82, a remarkable span in an age when life was often short and brutal. She was laid to rest at Fontevraud, beside Henry II and Richard the Lionheart, husband and son, rivals and allies. Her tomb effigy shows her not with folded hands in prayer, but holding an open book, as if still reading, still learning, still ruling. Her legacy was immense. A duchess, two-time queen, mother of kings, patron of culture, and one of the most formidable women in medieval history. Eleanor of Aquitaine had lived not just one life, but many, and in each she had left an indelible mark on Europe. Long before swords were unsheathed or ships set sail, the Crusades began with something far quieter and more intimate, a vow. For knights and peasants alike, the road to Jerusalem started not on the battlefield, but at the altar. In the dim light of medieval churches, men and women stood before priests, confessing their sins and swearing to take the long, dangerous road east. This was no casual promise. It was a binding oath, spoken aloud and sealed with the sign of the cross. When someone took the cross, it wasn't just a metaphor. The priest would bless strips of cloth shaped into small red crosses, and sew them onto the pilgrim's cloak or tunic. That symbol instantly transformed the wearer. A farmer was no longer just a farmer. A knight was no longer just a knight. They were now crusadi, marked by the cross, publicly and permanently committed to the journey. From that moment, their lives were no longer their own. They belonged to God's cause. This vow carried profound weight. It was believed that the pilgrimage itself, regardless of the outcome, could cleanse the soul. To walk to the land where Christ had lived, died, and risen was considered the highest form of devotion. And the risks? Enormous. Pilgrims knew they might never return. Bandits, disease, starvation, war. The road to Jerusalem was one of the most perilous undertakings of the Middle Ages. Yet still, people flocked to swear the vow. For knights, the commitment was doubly heavy. They weren't just promising to walk the pilgrim's road, but also to defend it with their swords. The crusade was framed as both journey and war, a march of penance that would end, if God willed it, with the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre. For commoners, the vow often meant abandoning farms, families, and entire livelihoods. To take the cross was to embrace uncertainty, trusting that heaven itself was watching. This act of devotion was intensely public. Families wept as fathers, sons, and daughters donned the cross, knowing the journey might claim their lives. But there was pride, too. In towns across Europe, pilgrims became walking symbols of faith, marked by the simple red cloth that signified they were bound for Jerusalem. The Crusades, then, began not in blood but in faith. Each campaign was fueled first by the whispered words of a vow, and the quiet courage it demanded. Once the vow was taken, the pilgrim's journey was sanctified with blessings and promises. The Church understood. No one would leave hearth and home, risk life and fortune, without powerful spiritual incentives. And so indulgences became the heartbeat of Crusader culture. Popes, bishops, and priests proclaimed that those who marched east were not merely travelers, but soldiers of Christ. To them was offered what no earthly treasure could rival: remission of sins. For many medieval Christians, burdened by the constant fear of damnation, this was salvation wrapped in parchment and seal. Urban II's Fairytale in 1095 at Clermont had made it clear: whoever goes to Jerusalem, if only out of devotion, shall have immediate remission of sins. These words echoed across Europe, binding spiritual reward to physical journey. The blessings came in layers. Before departing, Crusaders received Mass and holy rites, often kneeling barefoot before bishops as prayers were said for their safe travel. Some carried with them relics, small fragments of saints' bones, bits of cloth, or even soil from holy sites, believed to grant divine protection. Priests sprinkled pilgrims with holy water and gave them tokens of faith, assuring them that every mile walked was counted in heaven's ledger. But indulgences were more than abstract promises. They shaped the psychology of the Crusaders. For the poor peasant, it meant escape from the weight of everyday sin. For the knight, often stained with the blood of battles and feuds, it offered a chance at redemption. The Church preached that fighting in the East could cleanse the guilt of killing, because this time, the sword was raised in God's service. To die on the road to Jerusalem was not failure, but martyrdom, a ticket to paradise. These spiritual rewards gave the crusade its unique identity. Unlike a simple pilgrimage where one sought personal salvation, the crusade combined penance with military duty. Each prayer before departure, each blessing, each indulgence, transformed the dangerous journey into a sacred mission. Even the hardships ahead, hunger, thirst, wounds, were reframed as part of the pilgrim's penance. In the eyes of those who swore the vow, the road was not paved with despair, but with hope. Every blister, every drop of sweat, every heartbeat under the burning sun was a step toward cleansing the soul. In Crusader culture, blessings and indulgences weren't just comforts. They were the very fuel that kept men and women marching toward the distant, shimmering promise of Jerusalem. Once the vow was sworn and indulgences secured, the reality of pilgrimage began. The road itself. Reaching the Holy Land was no short stroll. It was a trek across continents, rivers, mountains, and deserts. Pilgrims and crusaders had two main choices: by land or by sea. Each path carried its own perils. The overland route wound through the heart of Europe, across the Alps, down through Hungary, the Balkans, and Byzantine territory. It was a march that could take months, even a year. Entire villages seemed to uproot themselves as peasants, priests, and knights joined the throngs heading east. Chroniclers describe endless processions of wagons creaking along muddy tracks, women carrying children, and priests leading hymns to keep spirits high. Yet the road was also dangerous. Robbers preyed on the weak. Supplies often ran short. Local lords sometimes resented the flood of strangers trampling through their lands. The sea route promised swifter passage. Pilgrims boarded ships in Italian ports like Venice, Genoa, or Bari, sailing toward Constantinople or directly to the Levant. But the Mediterranean was no gentle highway. Storms could sink entire fleets. Disease spread like wildfire in the cramped, filthy holds of medieval ships. Many who set sail never saw land again, their bones claimed by the sea. Travel was penance in itself. Food was scarce, often little more than hard bread and thin stew. Fresh water? A luxury. Disease, dysentery, fevers, plague, stalked the camps where thousands gathered each night. Those who survived bore the marks of the road. Blistered feet, gaunt faces, scars from encounters with brigands or hostile locals. Yet the hardships were also bound with ritual. Pilgrims stopped at shrines along the way, praying before relics that promised protection. In Byzantium, they marveled at Hagia Sophia's domes, feeling they had stepped into heaven's vestibule. Each stop reminded them that their suffering had meaning, that every mile brought them closer to their destination in Jerusalem. The road became a theater of contrasts. Faith and fear, devotion and despair. Some dropped out, returning home in shame. Others pressed on, driven by the belief that the journey itself was a holy act, worth every drop of sweat and blood. For in Crusader culture, the destination was glorious, but the road, the grueling, punishing, sanctified road, was itself part of salvation. For those who survived the long, punishing journey, the sight of Jerusalem was overwhelming. Pilgrims who had trudged across Europe or braved the storms of the Mediterranean often wept when they first glimpsed the city's walls. Chroniclers described men and women falling to their knees, kissing the ground, praising God with tears streaming down their faces. To them, this was no ordinary destination. It was the earthly heart of heaven. The rituals of arrival were deeply symbolic. Pilgrims entered the city barefoot, a gesture of humility, and often circled its walls in silent reverence. Many went directly to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site where Christ was believed to have been crucified, buried, and resurrected. To kneel before the tomb was the ultimate goal of their pilgrimage. They touched the stone of the anointing, lit candles, and sometimes pressed small relics against the sacred rock, believing it absorbed holiness. For knights who had come with sword in hand, this moment carried the weight of justification. All the battles and bloodshed were sanctified by reaching this shrine. But Jerusalem was not the only holy site. Pilgrims climbed the Mount of Olives, where Christ had ascended, and walked the Via Dolorosa, retracing his steps to Calvary. They prayed in Bethlehem at the Church of the Nativity, and some ventured to Galilee to see the sea where Christ had walked upon the waters. Each site was a layer in the spiritual map of salvation, a living text of the Bible laid out in stone and earth. For commoners, these visits were acts of awe and devotion. For knights and nobles, the crusade also reinforced its central idea. It was a holy war fused with a sacred pilgrimage. The relics they touched, the blessings they received, the indulgences granted upon completing the journey, all tied their spiritual fate to the land itself. The arrival was often capped with confession and communion, sealing the pilgrim's spiritual achievement. Some shaved their heads or donned simple garments as a sign of rebirth. Others brought back tokens, oil from lamps at the sepulchre, or small crosses made from local wood, as proof of their accomplishment. To step into Jerusalem was to step into the center of the medieval imagination. For a Crusader pilgrim, reaching the Holy Land was not the end of the journey, but the crowning act of faith, where the physical world and the divine seemed to meet. For Crusader pilgrims, the Holy Land was not only a place of prayer, but also a treasury of sacred objects. Few returned home empty-handed. To touch, carry, or even own a fragment from Jerusalem was to bring back proof of devotion, a piece of sanctity that could transform one's household, chapel, or village. The most coveted treasures were relics. Some were grand, claimed splinters of the true cross, drops of Christ's blood preserved in crystal vials, or shavings of saints' bones encased in golden reliquaries. These were objects bishops and princes sought, not only for their spiritual value, but for the prestige they brought. To house such a relic, an elevated church was transformed into a pilgrimage center of its own, drawing visitors, offerings, and power. But relics weren't reserved only for kings and bishops. Ordinary pilgrims collected humbler tokens, small crosses carved from olive wood, bottles of oil from lamps burning in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or flasks filled with water from the Jordan River. These ampullae, stamped with holy symbols, were worn around the neck or displayed at home as visible proof of the journey. Some were even believed to offer healing, as if the holiness of the land itself had seeped into the object. Knights too returned with relics, often carrying them into future battles. A piece of cloth touched to the sepulchre might be stitched into a banner. A carved cross might be fastened to a sword's hilt. These relics were not only signs of faith, but talismans of divine protection in warfare. For Crusader culture, relics blurred the line between spiritual devotion and martial duty. The trade in these objects was brisk. Local artisans in Jerusalem and Bethlehem catered to the demand, producing carved souvenirs and holy tokens for waves of pilgrims. Some accused unscrupulous sellers of passing off typical trinkets as sacred treasures. However, for many buyers, authenticity mattered less than the personal memories the item evoked. When pilgrims returned home, their relics and souvenirs became part of their identity. Displayed in parish churches, they inspired awe among neighbors who had never left their village. Stories of the journey were retold beside the relics, binding communities to the larger narrative of Christendom. In Crusader culture, the relic was more than a keepsake. It was living proof, a fragment of the Holy Land that whispered of sacrifice, endurance, and the sacred journey that had been completed. To medieval Christians, pilgrimage was not meant to be an easy endeavor. Hardship was the very point. The Crusades, framed as armed pilgrimages, fully embraced this idea. Every blister, every wound, every hunger pang was seen as penance, a cleansing of the soul through pain. Knights and peasants alike believed that the physical trials of the road were spiritual currency, paying down the debts of sin. Fasting was a common practice, sometimes forced by necessity, other times chosen deliberately. Food often dwindled to scraps of hard bread or thin broth, and pilgrims interpreted their empty stomachs as holy discipline. Hunger became prayer, endured with the hope that each pang brought them closer to salvation. Even thirst in the desert was reframed as a holy trial mirroring Christ's own suffering in the wilderness. Travel itself was designed to test humility. Many pilgrims walked barefoot for long stretches, their feet bleeding on stony paths, seeing each cut as another offering to God. Some carried heavy crosses or chains, weighing down their bodies as a reminder of Christ's burden. Illness and wounds, instead of being curses, were often understood as gifts. Pain transformed into proof of devotion. Knights who were used to wealth, horses, and the comforts of rank found themselves forced into the same hardships as commoners. This leveling effect reinforced the idea that all pilgrims, noble or peasant, stood equal before God. Marching together under the blazing sun, sleeping on hard ground, or battling swarms of flies blurred social lines. The suffering itself united them. The rituals of penance extended even into battle. Crusaders were told that wounds received in combat were not only honorable but redemptive. To shed blood in the service of Christ's cause was a fast track to heavenly reward. The same sword that had once caused sinful violence could, in the Holy Land, become an instrument of salvation. At holy sites, pilgrims often sought to intensify their penance. Some scourged themselves, whipping their backs until blood ran. Others lay prostrate for hours on the stones of the Holy Sepulchre, weeping openly. These acts were not viewed as extremes, but rather as powerful demonstrations of faith. In Crusader culture, suffering was not considered a failure. It was the proof of sincerity. The harder the road, the greater the redemption. The very act of enduring pain turned the pilgrimage into a living prayer, one step closer to the eternal promise of forgiveness. Pilgrimage was never a solitary act. Though individuals took the vow, the journey itself was profoundly communal. To survive the long march to Jerusalem, Crusader pilgrims leaned on one another, forging bonds that blurred the lines of class, wealth, and status. In this shared trial, a knight, a priest, and a peasant might walk side by side, united by the cross stitched on their cloaks. Brotherhood began at home, when groups from the same town or region set out together. Known as confraternities, these bands of pilgrims pooled resources, shared food, and protected one another along the way. They sang hymns in unison, prayed as a unified body, and comforted one another through illness and death. In a world where travel was perilous, Fellowship was both practical and spiritual. Each pilgrim saw the others not just as companions, but as fellow soldiers of Christ. Knights often took this communal spirit further, pledging to defend the weaker members of the group. Chronicles describe armed crusaders guarding caravans of peasants, treating the safeguarding of unarmed pilgrims as part of their holy duty. At night, nobles and commoners alike camped together, eating from the same pots, sharing stories around the fire. The hardships of the road stripped away some of the rigid hierarchies of medieval life, if only temporarily. This sense of unity extended into rituals of death. Pilgrims who died on the road were not left unmarked. Their companions buried them with prayers and makeshift crosses, believing that even if they never reached Jerusalem, their vow had been fulfilled in heaven's eyes. In this way, every member of the group carried the weight of the others, ensuring that no pilgrim sacrifice was forgotten. The Brotherhood of the Cross also inspired the rise of formal military orders, such as the Knights Templar and Hospitallers. These groups institutionalized the idea of defending pilgrims, creating permanent communities dedicated to both martial protection and spiritual service. They became symbols of the fusion between pilgrimage and warfare, embodying the communal ethos of the crusade on a grand scale. On the pilgrim road, loneliness gave way to solidarity. Every hymn sung, every burden carried, every grave dug, deepened the sense that they were more than individuals. They were a body of Christ's faithful, journeying together toward redemption. The road to Jerusalem was brutal, but it was never walked alone. For those who survived the long journey to Jerusalem and back, the return home was more than just a homecoming. It was a profound experience. It was a transformation. The pilgrims did not return as the same men and women who had left. They returned marked by experience, sanctified by hardship, and carrying stories and objects that set them apart from neighbors who had never traveled beyond the next village. The first sign of this transformation was visible, the cross on their garments. Many continued to wear the symbol after their return, proof that they had fulfilled their vow. To the community, it was a badge of honor. Parish priests welcomed them back with Thanksgiving masses, while neighbors gathered to hear tales of the distant Holy Land. These stories, of Byzantium's glittering domes, of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, of battles fought under the desert sun, became part of the oral culture of medieval Europe, carried from hearth to hearth. Prestige followed naturally. A knight who had walked barefoot into Jerusalem could claim not only military honor, but also spiritual authority. His name carried weight in local courts. His words carried moral credibility. For commoners, the pilgrimage was an elevation in itself. A peasant who had stood at the sepulchre could never again be dismissed as ordinary. He had seen with his own eyes the center of Christendom. Souvenirs and relics reinforced this aura. A flask filled with Jordan water, a splinter of olive wood from the Mount of Olives. A cross touched to the sepulchre became physical proof of the journey. Families displayed them in homes or parish churches, where they became objects of local devotion. In some places, these relics transformed small villages into new centers of pilgrimage, drawing visitors eager to touch a fragment of holiness brought from the East. The Crusader pilgrims' return also shaped political identity. Nobles boasted of their journey in charters, carving pilgrim crosses into their seals. Towns commemorated their warriors' vows in murals and churches, weaving the pilgrimage into civic pride. Even kings used it as propaganda, calling themselves defenders of the Holy Sepulchre to legitimize their reigns. For the individual pilgrim, however, the most profound change was inward. They had endured hunger, thirst, danger, and death. To return alive was to believe that God Himself had guided their steps. Their lives became a living testimony to the power of faith. The pilgrimage ended at home, but its impact lingered. In every tale told, every relic displayed, every whispered prayer before a small piece of the Holy Land. By the time the last crusading armies faded from history, pilgrimage had already left its mark on medieval Europe. What began as personal journeys of penance had merged with the fury of holy war, creating a cultural hybrid unlike anything before. To be a crusader was to be both soldier and pilgrim, bound by oath, protected by indulgences, and defined by the belief that suffering and sacrifice opened the gates of heaven. The fusion of pilgrimage and warfare reshaped the medieval imagination. Knights who once fought for feudal lords now saw their battles as steps on a sacred road. Every campaign east was framed as a continuation of the pilgrim's vow. Even failure on the battlefield could be reframed as spiritual triumph, since simply setting foot on the journey was believed to cleanse the soul. Crusader sermons preached that Christ himself walked beside the armies, and each wound, hunger pang, or death along the way was part of God's plan. This ethos permeated daily life in Europe. Shrines and local pilgrimages flourished, modeled on the incredible journey to Jerusalem. Villagers who could never hope to cross the Mediterranean made more minor pilgrimages to regional holy sites, believing the same indulgences applied in miniature. The culture of walking, suffering, and praying as penitence became a shared ritual across Christendom. The Crusades also institutionalized the protection of pilgrims. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, were born from this need. Their dual role as monks and warriors embodied the Crusader ideal: to pray like pilgrims and fight like soldiers. Even centuries later, their memory carried the aura of men who had given their lives to safeguard the Holy Road. Perhaps most importantly, pilgrimage left behind stories. Chroniclers filled Europe with tales of brave knights, humble peasants, and devout queens who endured the journey east. These accounts were read aloud in monasteries, retold in markets, and sung by troubadours. They gave meaning not only to individual sacrifice, but to the collective identity of medieval Christendom. By 1200, the Crusader pilgrimage had become more than an event. It was a cultural template. It taught that devotion was not passive, but active, that salvation required both prayer and pain. For Europe, the Holy Road to Jerusalem had become a mirror, reflecting its fears, hopes, and ambitions. And though the Crusader states would fall, the idea of pilgrimage as a sacred struggle remained etched into the medieval soul, a legacy that outlived the wars themselves. By the late 12th century, the Crusader states, carved out of the Holy Land after 1099, were fragile kingdoms, perched precariously on foreign soil, and nearly a century had passed since the First Crusade stormed Jerusalem. And in that time, Latin lords had grown accustomed to ruling in the East. But wealth and pride bred complacency. The kingdom of Jerusalem was divided by rival factions. Its barons quarreled even as threats mounted on the horizon. Their arrogance led them to underestimate the man who would soon bring their downfall. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known to the West as Saladin. Saladin was not just a warrior, but a statesman. He united Egypt and Syria under his rule. His genius lay not merely in tactics, but in patience. While the Crusader barons bickered, he built an empire. Through diplomacy, marriages, and relentless campaigning, he transformed scattered Muslim territories into a cohesive power that could finally push back against the Crusaders. His vision was simple but profound. Jerusalem, sacred to Islam, must be reclaimed. The spark came in 1187 when Raynald of Chatillon, a notoriously reckless Crusader lord, broke the fragile truce by attacking a Muslim caravan. To Saladin, this was no minor offense. It was casus belli, a holy mandate for war. He called for jihad, rallying thousands to his banner, determined to bring an end to nearly a century of foreign occupation. The decisive moment arrived at the Horns of Hattin, a double-peaked hill near the Sea of Galilee. The Crusader king, Guy of Lusignan, marched his army straight into Saladin's trap. With supplies low and morale crumbling, they found themselves surrounded in the blistering July heat. Saladin's forces cut off their access to water, setting grass fires to choke them with smoke. The once proud knights of Jerusalem, armored in steel, collapsed under the sun, their thirst unquenchable, their discipline broken. When the final clash came, the Crusaders were already beaten in spirit. Thousands were captured, including King Guy himself. The true cross, Christianity's most sacred relic, was seized by Saladin's men, a symbolic and psychological blow as devastating as the battlefield defeat itself. The victory at Hattin shattered the military backbone of the Crusader kingdom. With its armies destroyed, its leaders humiliated, and its holy relic lost, Jerusalem lay defenseless. Saladin's path to the sacred city was clear, and the fate of the Crusader dream hung in the balance. The Battle of Hattin had broken the spine of the Crusader kingdom. With their army annihilated and their king in chains, the lords of Jerusalem could do little but watch as Saladin's forces advanced. In the summer of 1187, his banners swept across the countryside, taking castle after castle with terrifying speed. Towns that had once seemed secure now surrendered with barely a fight, their garrisons too shaken to resist. What had taken the Crusaders decades to build, Saladin dismantled in weeks. His campaign was methodical. He did not rush unthinkingly for Jerusalem. Instead, he cut away its defenses piece by piece. Acre, the bustling port that connected the kingdom to Europe, fell. Nablus, Jaffa, Caesarea, Ascalon all crumbled before his advance. The strategy was clear: isolate Jerusalem, deny it reinforcements, and then strike the final blow. For the Crusaders, the psychological impact was devastating. Reports of Saladin's victory at Hattin spread like wildfire, accompanied by stories of noble captives and the loss of the true cross. Pilgrims, merchants, and local villagers alike fled to Jerusalem, swelling its population and straining its resources. Within the walls, despair mingled with defiance. The city's new defenders were not the proud knights of Hattin. They were a patchwork of survivors, civilians, and desperate refugees. Yet, amid the panic, one figure emerged to lead Jerusalem's defense: Bl0od of Ibelin. Captured at Hattin but released on parole, he had sworn to Saladin he would not fight. But when he saw the city's helpless state, he broke his word, though reportedly with Saladin's reluctant permission, granted on condition that he take up arms only to protect his family. Instead, Bl0od became the soul of Jerusalem's resistance, rallying a battered populace for what they knew might be their final stand. Meanwhile, Saladin marched steadily onward, his army buoyed by the momentum of victory and the promise of reclaiming Islam's holiest city. Chroniclers described the confidence of his men as they encircled Jerusalem. The Crusaders had once entered the town with blood and fire, but now it would return to Muslim hands. By late September 1187, Saladin's banners appeared before Jerusalem's gates. The city that the Crusaders had held for nearly a century now faced its reckoning. The defenders braced themselves, but few doubted the outcome. The age of Crusader Jerusalem was about to end. When Saladin's army arrived before Jerusalem in late September 1187, the mood within the city was grim. For nearly a century, the Crusaders had called Jerusalem the heart of their kingdom. But now, the kingdom of heaven was reduced to frightened refugees, scattered knights, and weary survivors from Hattin. The walls still stood tall, but behind them, morale was low, supplies were thin, and the defenders were vastly outnumbered. Saladin wasted no time. His forces encircled the city, cutting it off from escape or aid. Siege engines were brought forward, massive wooden towers, catapults, and mangonels, all aimed at battering down the walls that had once seemed impenetrable. To the defenders, the thud of stones and the creak of advancing towers were constant reminders that the end was near. Inside, Bl0od of Ibelin struggled to rally the citizens. Though only a handful of knights remained, he knighted every non-disabled boy of fighting age, arming them with whatever weapons could be found. Chroniclers describe women and children helping carry stones, boiling water, and even molten pitch to hurl down on attackers. It was not just an army holding the city, but an entire population preparing to die if necessary. The memory of 1099 hung heavily over both sides. When the Crusaders had stormed Jerusalem in the First Crusade, they unleashed a massacre that shocked the Muslim world. Men, women, and children were slaughtered in streets and mosques. Many defenders now feared the same fate awaited them if the city fell. Some even urged desperate measures, threatening to burn down the Dome of the Rock and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre rather than see them captured. Saladin, however, showed a different spirit. He ordered his men to fight with discipline, forbidding indiscriminate slaughter. Still, he pressed the siege with relentless force. Siege towers rumbled forward. Battering rams struck the gates. Muslim troops fought tirelessly to breach the walls. After days of bombardment, the defenses began to crumble. The Crusaders fought valiantly, but the imbalance was too significant. By early October, Jerusalem was at breaking point. Bl0od recognized the truth. Continued resistance would mean not just defeat, but a massacre. The city could not be saved by arms alone. If Jerusalem were to endure, its salvation would have to come not from swords, but from negotiation with Saladin himself. As Jerusalem's walls shuddered under constant bombardment, Bl0od of Ibelin knew the city's fall was only a matter of time. The defenders were exhausted. Supplies dwindled. Morale hovered near collapse. But surrender was not an easy choice. The memory of 1099, the Crusaders' own massacre of Jerusalem's inhabitants, haunted the city. Men and women alike feared that if the Muslims stormed the walls, every soul inside would be slaughtered in revenge. Bl0od, caught between despair and duty, chose diplomacy. He requested an audience with Saladin. Chroniclers record that the Sultan received him with calm dignity, listening as Bl0od argued for the lives of Jerusalem's people. The knight did not beg. Instead, he threatened. If no terms were offered, the defenders would burn the holy sites, slaughter Muslim prisoners, and force Saladin to capture nothing but ashes. It was a desperate gamble, meant to show that the defenders had nothing left to lose. Saladin, however, was unmoved by threats, but swayed by principle. His reputation for honor was already renowned, and here he saw an opportunity to contrast himself with the brutality of the Crusaders 88 years earlier. Instead of demanding blood, he offered terms of surrender. The citizens of Jerusalem could ransom themselves. Men for 10 dinars, women for 5, children for 1. Those who paid would be allowed to leave in peace, carrying their possessions with them. For those too poor to pay, Saladin promised mercy, declaring that none would be killed. The terms stunned the defenders. Expecting annihilation, they were instead given a chance at survival. Bl0od accepted, and soon word spread throughout the city. Relief replaced terror, though fear lingered for those too poor to afford ransom. Moved by their plight, Bl0od and the city's clergy pleaded with Saladin, who responded with further generosity, freeing thousands of destitute Christians at his own expense. Even his commanders followed suit, purchasing the freedom of captives with their own wealth. The contrast was unmistakable. Where the Crusaders had once drenched Jerusalem in blood, Saladin promised a more merciful conquest. The agreement did not erase the sorrow of defeat, but it spared the city from the nightmare of massacre. On October 2nd, 1187, the gates of Jerusalem opened, not to slaughter, but to a new chapter under Saladin's rule. On October 2nd, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered. The gates that had once been barred in desperation now opened to Saladin's army. Yet, unlike the storm of blood and fire that had marked the Crusader conquest in 1099, the handover was astonishingly calm. No massacre, no plunder, just an orderly transition of power, orchestrated with deliberate restraint. Bl0od of Ibelin, who had defended the city to the end, walked beside Saladin's men to oversee the process. The defeated Crusaders and civilian population gathered their belongings, preparing for exile. Families carried what little they could: bundles of clothes, cooking pots, cherished icons, while priests led processions, chanting hymns as they left behind the city they had called holy for nearly a century. The payment of ransoms became the practical business of surrender. Wealthier citizens handed over coins to secure safe passage, while the poor trembled at their inability to pay. True to his word, Saladin did not allow mass slaughter or indiscriminate slavery. He personally paid for the freedom of thousands, and his commanders followed his example. Even his own family contributed. Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, ransomed many people with low incomes from his private purse. The spectacle of mercy spread quickly, reshaping how Jerusalem's fall would be remembered. Saladin's entry into the city was staged with symbolic power. He rode through the streets not in triumphal arrogance, but in humility, dismounting to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which had been used as a church under Crusader rule. The Dome of the Rock, stripped of its Christian altars, was cleansed and rededicated as a Muslim sanctuary. The city's most sacred sites were restored to their original place in Islamic devotion. The handover was not without pain. For Christians, it was an exile, a bitter end to the kingdom built with so much blood. Tears flowed as they left Jerusalem, their chants echoing through the streets one last time. Yet, even in loss, they acknowledged that Saladin had kept his word. The city had not been drowned in blood, as it had in 1099. This moment defined Saladin's legacy. Where others had chosen vengeance, he chose restraint. In an age when brutality was the norm, his mercy stood out as both a political calculation and a genuine act of faith. Jerusalem had changed hands, but it had been spared destruction. News of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe like a thunderclap. In October 1187, envoys, pilgrims, and merchants carried the story westward. The Holy City, held by the Crusaders for nearly a century, had been lost. For Christendom, it was more than a military defeat. It was a spiritual catastrophe, the very heart of Christian devotion. The site of Christ's passion and resurrection was once again in Muslim hands. Pope Urban III is said to have collapsed in grief upon hearing the news, dying shortly afterward. His successor, Gregory VIII, wasted no time. In November 1187, he issued the papal bull Audita Tremendi, calling all of Christendom to arms. This was not just another campaign. It was proclaimed as the greatest crusade yet, demanding the participation of kings, nobles, and commoners alike. The loss of Jerusalem was framed as a punishment for sin, a divine chastisement that could only be answered with penance and holy war. Across Europe, pulpits thundered with sermons. Preachers painted vivid images of Christian pilgrims now barred from the Holy Sepulchre, of relics seized, of churches stripped of their altars. The true cross, captured at Hattin, became a symbol of humiliation. It was not only the city that had been lost, but also the spiritual prestige of Christendom itself. The call to arms spread with unprecedented urgency. Monarchs who had once hesitated to join crusading expeditions now felt the weight of obligation. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire all took the cross, committing themselves to what would become the Third Crusade. This was the first time Europe's greatest rulers joined forces for a single crusading cause. But alongside outrage came a strange respect. Accounts of Saladin's mercy circulated in Europe, often with admiration. Chroniclers noted that he had spared lives, ransomed captives, and honored his promises, behavior that contrasted starkly with the bloody conquest of 1099. Some European writers even described him as a model of chivalry, a paradoxical foe both feared and admired. For ordinary Christians, however, nuance mattered little. The Holy City was gone, and the road to salvation seemed blocked. Pilgrims mourned, priests wept. Villages across Europe rang with the cries of families sending fathers and sons to reclaim Jerusalem. The fall of 1187 was not just a military turning point. It was a cultural earthquake that shook the entire medieval world. And from its tremors, the most excellent crusading effort in history was born. With Jerusalem secured in October 1187, Saladin's task was not finished. He had won the jewel of the Holy Land, but he knew that Europe would not let it go unchallenged. The fall of the city had been too great a shock. The armies of Christendom would surely march again. Saladin's genius lay not only in winning battles, but in preparing for what would come next, securing his victory so it would endure. His priority was religious restoration. The Crusaders had turned Islamic holy places into Christian shrines, and Saladin reversed this process with deliberate care. The Dome of the Rock was cleansed and rededicated to Islam, its golden dome polished and adorned with Quranic inscriptions proclaiming God's greatness. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, used as a palace and church under Crusader rule, was purified and reopened for prayer. For Muslims across the region, the liberation of Jerusalem was not only political, but spiritual, a renewal of sacred space. At the same time, Saladin maintained a careful balance with the city's Christian population. Although many departed, others remained, and he ensured that churches such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre were spared destruction. Pilgrimage would still be allowed, albeit under Muslim rule. This decision bolstered his reputation for mercy and helped avoid unnecessary unrest. Strategically, Saladin turned to fortifications. He strengthened the city's defenses, rebuilt damaged walls, and garrisoned key strongholds throughout Palestine. Castles at Jaffa, Ascalon, and Acre, either newly captured or surrendered, were repaired to create a defensive buffer. He understood that holding Jerusalem required controlling the surrounding ports and fortresses, thereby cutting off potential Crusader reinforcements from Europe. Politically, he worked to solidify alliances. The armies that had brought him victory were not just his own. They came from across the Muslim world: Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia. Saladin rewarded loyal emirs, securing the loyalty of his Kurdish and Turkish commanders, and reinforced the idea that this was not merely his triumph, but a victory for Islam as a whole. His authority, already immense, now carried the prestige of the man who had restored Jerusalem to Muslim rule. But even as he consolidated power, Saladin did not underestimate his enemies. He knew the kings of Europe were rallying. The Third Crusade was coming, led by Richard the Lionheart, Philip of France, and Frederick Barbarossa. Jerusalem's recapture was the height of his glory, but it also set the stage for his greatest challenge. By 1189, word of Jerusalem's fall had galvanized Europe, and the mightiest crusading force in history began to descend on the Levant. The Third Crusade was no ragtag army of minor lords. It was led by three of Europe's most powerful rulers: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England. To Saladin, this was the storm he had long anticipated. Though Frederick's sudden death on the march, drowning in a river in Anatolia, crippled the German contingent, the forces of Philip and Richard eventually reached the Holy Land. Almost immediately, they made their presence felt. The first major test came at Acre, where Crusader remnants had laid siege to the city since 1189. When Richard arrived in 1191, he transformed the stalemate into a relentless assault. After months of grinding battle, disease, starvation, naval bombardments, Acre fell. For Saladin, it was the first bitter taste of reversal since Hattin. The stage was set for a titanic struggle between two men whose reputations would become legend: Saladin and Richard. Richard was everything his epithet suggested: a warrior king of immense courage, skilled in tactics, and utterly fearless in battle. Chroniclers describe him charging into the fray with a ferocity that inspired his men and unsettled his enemies. Saladin, by contrast, was the master strategist, cautious yet decisive, preferring attrition and maneuver over reckless charges. Their duel was not just of armies, but of wills and reputations. The clash at Arsuf in September 1191 epitomized this contest. Saladin's cavalry harassed the Crusaders as they marched along the coast, hoping to break their discipline. For hours, the Christians endured under a hail of arrows, until Richard unleashed a devastating countercharge that smashed Saladin's lines. Though not a decisive defeat, Arsuf restored Crusader confidence and cemented Richard's fame. Yet Saladin was no mere antagonist in Richard's story. Even his enemies acknowledged his nobility. During campaigns, he sent gifts of fruit and snow, yes, snow, shipped from mountaintops, to the sick Lionheart. And when Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him 2 replacements. Their rivalry was fierce, but tempered by mutual respect. Each recognized in the other a worthy foe. The struggle continued in a series of indecisive campaigns along the coast. Richard recaptured Jaffa, but Jerusalem remained elusive. Saladin's careful defense and scorched earth tactics denied the Crusaders the supplies and momentum needed for a final push. The Lionheart's sword was mighty, but the city still lay in Muslim hands. By 1192, both sides were exhausted. Richard the Lionheart had reclaimed Acre and triumphed at Arsuf, proven himself to be one of the most formidable warriors of his age. Yet despite his victories, Jerusalem eluded him. Twice he marched toward the holy city, and twice he turned back. The Crusaders lacked supplies, faced endless harassment from Saladin's forces, feared that even if they captured Jerusalem, they could not hold it. For Richard, the dream of retaking the sepulchre remained tantalizingly out of reach. Saladin, too, was weary. Years of campaigning had drained his treasury and tested his armies. While his prestige soared after the capture of Jerusalem, holding the city against wave after wave of Crusaders came at immense cost. His empire stretched from Egypt to Syria, and he needed stability to secure it. Both commanders, recognizing the futility of endless war, moved toward negotiation. In September 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa was signed. Its terms reflected compromise. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, a triumph for Saladin. But Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe passage to the city's holy sites. Coastal towns from Jaffa to Tyre stayed in Crusader hands, ensuring a foothold for the West. For both leaders, it was an imperfect peace, but it preserved their honor and spared their exhausted followers further bloodshed. Richard departed the Holy Land soon after, never setting foot in Jerusalem. Chroniclers say he approached the city, but refused to enter as a pilgrim, unwilling to behold the sepulchre without reclaiming it. Saladin, meanwhile, returned to Damascus, his health failing after years of relentless strain. In 1193, only a few months after Richard sailed home, the great Sultan died. At his funeral, mourners discovered the measure of the man. Though he had ruled a vast empire and commanded immense wealth, Saladin's coffers were nearly empty. He had given away much of his fortune in charity, arms, and ransom for captives. He was buried with little more than a simple shroud, his legacy resting not in treasure, but in the memory of his deeds. For Muslims, he was the liberator of Jerusalem, the unifier of the faithful. For Christians, he was a formidable foe yet also a figure of respect, remembered for his mercy and chivalry. In an age of brutality, Saladin stood apart, embodying both the sword and the spirit of leadership. His name endures as the man who reclaimed the holy city, and whose mercy became as legendary as his victories.